Good morning, boys and girls, and welcome back to the southern wing of the Stink Bug Works. This morning, I have a plethora of things to talk about, a plethora of piñatas of things to talk about. First of all, Ferrari. What do you think? Huh? Is that badass? That's badass. Almost looks a little big for this boat, but you know what? Ferrari liked big motors and lots of cylinders. Old Enzo would be proud. Okay, this is essentially seaworthy. I have a couple of little cosmetic details to clean up on, but I've solved the Gazinta and the Gazada for the water. I've got speed control installed. I've got the wires. I'm going to put a little bit of shrink tube around that to hold that down. I've got the wires consolidated. It's a shoehorn fit in there. I've got jam foam up in there. It's that pool noodle foam that comes in flat sheets. But that's what I've cut out, and I just, stacked layers in there. I've got some EPP foam here. So with all this foam, you folks might want to know. Let's find out. Let's find out together. I've never done this. I should move it where I can see it. It's in grams. This whole thing weighs 58.59 grams, 2 ounces. This big old thing weighs 2 ounces. Okay, now that I've talked about this, and that's about all the progress I've made on it. I've put the jam foam in. I've drawn lines all over it. I'm, cleaning things up. Today's project will be to remove all the guts, start taping up. There's a couple little rough edges along this lip that I want to clean up and such. So it'll be the last sanding and priming and filling before it gets its red Ferrari red paint. Now, what we're going to talk about today. Big B has an airplane, and Big B has some questions about airplanes. So I have a passing knowledge in airplanes. I mean, what's my name? How did I get it? Big B had questions about takeoffs and landings. So let's get down to the very basics of flight. Let's just say this is your runway right here. Now, airplanes, once they're in the air, wind has no meaning, as long as the air's not all stirred up. But if you're in a cubic thing of air, and that cubic thing of air is moving along as wind, and you're flying along inside that cubic thing of air, you're going to move with that cubic thing of air. And to the airplane, the outside air will be perfectly still, which is why you have 2 different speeds that you refer to when you're a RC pilot. You have airspeed. That's the speed of the airplane in this little box of air. And you have ground speed. That's the speed of the airplane in this box of air relative to the ground. Now, whenever you're close to the ground, the slower you're going, the better. So if your box of air is moving along like this, if you were to turn into the direction the wind is moving, your ground speed will be less. So let's just say, for the sake of matter, the wind is blowing this way, so your box is going like that. You want to take off into the wind because as you're standing still, the airplane sees, if it's blowing 10 miles an hour, the airspeed indicator is reading 10 miles an hour, even though you're parked standing still on the runway. So you automatically have an extra 10 miles an hour right there. And what makes an airplane fly is speed. You got to have speed over the wings to create lift. So you got 10 miles of free speed. If you were to turn around, you'd have minus 10 miles. So you'd have to get going 20 miles ground speed just to have a 10 mile an hour airspeed. So always take off and land into the wind. I'll tell you a great story. I was flying my 126 up in the Owens Valley, and it got really windy that day, and I was getting shot down, so I had to land at Independence. Now, the 126 has a landing speed of about 40 miles an hour, and the wind down the runway was blowing at about 40 miles an hour, so I came in real high and just kind of hovered on down. I'd be going forward at a ground speed of 1 or 2 miles an hour. Well, I'm still in situations like that, you carry a little extra airspeed. So I'm looking at 45 miles an hour, and the runway's just coming straight up at me. Finally got down and had to hit the brakes just to keep from rolling backwards. So back to reality here now. In order to land, you've got to have a plan. You can't just go, I'm going to land now. So in 99.999% of all aircraft aviations, you have your runway and you have what's called the pattern. And you fly a pattern around here and you take off and you land. And here's the way it works. You have your upwind leg, then you turn 90 degrees for your crosswind leg. You turn another 90 degrees for your downwind leg, and you're flying parallel to the runway. Another 90 degrees to your base leg, and another 90 degrees to final. And what that does is, you're the pilot and you're standing right here. What that does is it allows you to see the airplane. On this downwind leg, you can get things squared away for your landing. Now, airplanes have a good cruising speed, and they also have a landing speed. And a landing speed is quite slow and usually 1.5 times the stall speed, or right around there. So you want to get things slowed down, because the slower you are when you land, the better. Landing, I'm going to include a video at the end of this where I had to force an airplane onto the ground when I had too much airspeed. This thing weighed a ton. It was powered by 22 round cells, and I lost power right about here, and I was just flying around, and I lost power right about here, and I said, oh crap, I'm in my landing pattern now, and I was way high, so I had to blow off a bunch of speed, and as I'm coming down here, you can see me horsing the throttle, or horsing the elevator, trying to burn off some speed, because this was a swept wing airplane, and in those high angles of attack, they really blow off energy. But I had to zoom down the runway here and force it onto the ground, and then just slide to a stop. I had way too much energy because of poor planning. So, when you're flying your airplane, before your battery craps out on you, fly a pattern, take off. Now, for example, this one guy had a little airplane like yours, and he used to fly that pattern. He would be standing here, and he'd fly that pattern right here. He'd take off. He never left the runway. He never got more than 10 feet off the ground. In fact, if he was flying above eye level, he was high. And he would do that. He'd just take off, land, take off, land. Never went up past half of the runway, you know. Pissed a lot of people off because he hogged the runway, and that's a whole nother story. But this pattern works, you know, if you're flying a 747, if you're flying a micro thing indoor, it's always the same. You take off, crosswind, downwind, base, final. And so the deal is on your downwind, that's when you want to get things slowed down. That's when you get your gear out. That's when you get your flaps down. That's when you get from cruising speed to landing speed. That happens in this downwind leg. And actually, I could go you one more. If you're coming from someplace else, you enter your downwind on a diagonal like this, midfield. So if you're coming from over there, that's how you join, you know, and oftentimes there will be uncontrolled airports, and there'll be, you know, half a dozen guys flying around in this pattern. They'll all be talking to each other. It has, you know, this is a given elevation, usually about 800 to 1,000 feet above the runway. But in models, you know, if you're this guy, you know, you're slightly below eye level here. So adjust your pattern accordingly, but that's the best way to get things lined up to land. Have a pattern, practice that pattern. Imagine, if you would, there's a fountain here and 3 Christmas trees, and you're doing a full pond lap, a full pond oval. That's what you're doing. So do a full pond oval about your chosen runway. Now, the chosen runway can be just the dirt at your feet, but you always want your takeoff and landing into the wind. So if you can move your runway to match the wind, you know, then everything else moves with it. There you go. I'll clip in a clip of, God, when was this? This was probably 24 years ago. And Mike Morgan was the cameraman on that. He had a pretty nice camera. And for the most part, the airplane's back up against a blue sky. And you really can't tell how fast it's going. But at one point, I make a low pass down the runway, and I mean a low pass down the runway. And this airplane would do about 160 miles an hour, so it was moving out. So without further ado, here's your jet video and jet out.